talk for just a minute about the brain functions. And in other words, how the disease progresses through your brain and how it's going to affect the functions of those different areas. And Alzheimer's disease starts first in your hippocampus. So if you were to stick your finger about right here in about 2 inches, you'd hit your hippocampus. And that's where it strikes first. And the main function of the hippocampus is short-term memory. And when something happens to us or we hear something, we want to make sure that we can grab a hold of that information and keep it. And with Alzheimer's disease, that's one of the things that's going on, is that the brain and the hippocampus there can't hold on or retain that information of a new situation or new information. Also, that's where we learn to do new things, learn new information. So when that part of the brain's affected, it's very difficult for someone even in that earlier stage perhaps to learn new information. So just keep that in mind. We don't want to, I'll talk a little bit later, but we don't want to force someone to do something they're not capable of doing. So we'll get into more of that in a minute. Then it strikes the temporal lobe. In the temporal lobe, you have one on each side of your head. And the main function, there are several, but one of the main functions is language and communication. So when that part of the brain's affected, they have difficulty coming up with the right words to communicate with us, but also they're having a hard time understanding what we're saying to them. And so those are the first couple of clues that we see, the short-term memory problems and also difficulties with language and communication. Also the ability to name things. Maybe instead of saying, well, I forgot to put on my watch today, they might say, I forgot to put on my hand clock. They just have a difficulty with proper names. From there it goes to the frontal lobe, and it is amazing all the stuff that's going on in the front of your brain. Just to mention some of them, and one of the main functions up there is your personality. So you can imagine when damage is occurring in that front part of the brain, you might very well see some personality changes. But one of the things that we do there is we plan and we organize. And I'm not just talking about a big party, but we have to plan and organize the smallest details of our life. For instance, if I have a grandma and I say, Grandma, you need to get up and go to the bathroom. Well, that takes organization and planning to be able to get up and figure out, okay, now where's the bathroom? Got to make my legs go there. And so it really takes a lot of planning and organizing. And so I quite often see family members get very irritated at this point because, and I've heard it several times, maybe we have a wife who, her husband has Alzheimer's disease, and she'll say, I send him into the bathroom and take a shower, and you know what? I get so mad because he goes in there and he just stands. Well, he's not trying to give her a hard time. He got to the bathroom, and that's a good thing, but he must have gotten in there and just either forgotten, what am I supposed to do here? Or he's thinking, shower. I don't know what to do to take a shower. It's hard for us to understand because it's so automatic to us. And it sounds like one step to us, doesn't it? Go take a shower. It sounds like one step. But it's lots and lots and lots and lots of steps. The front part of the brain is also where we get started on a task. So maybe the same woman says, now it's lunchtime, you need to eat. Well, she might get the same thing. He's just kind of sitting there because he just doesn't know, what do I do to eat? And so that's where maybe just putting some food on the fork for him might very well be enough to really get him going. We just have to get them going on the task. And the automatic response kind of can kick in, that long-term memory can kick in. But at this point of the disease, when that front part is affected, they're going to need a little bit of cueing and maybe a little bit of physical help just to get them started on the task. Another thing that is up in the frontal part of the brain is our impulse control. And so sometimes, not all the times, but sometimes when someone has Alzheimer's disease or another disease that affects that front part of the brain, you might see verbal outbursts. They might get very angry for no apparent reason. They might start cussing up a storm.
Throwing things.
Pardon me?
Throwing things.
Throwing things, yes. Yes. Again, it's just because they've lost that impulse control. And it's sad too, because I often think, I think if a lot of these folks knew what they were doing, they would be pretty horrified to think that. Sometimes, for instance, we could have a man maybe who was a pastor, or a woman who was a church organist or whatever, and now they're cussing up a storm. It's not that they were bad people deep down. It's that we all have garbage in there. And you and I filter it out all the time. We know enough not to blurt out information that's not appropriate. But with Alzheimer's, you lose the knowledge that that's not appropriate. Or sometimes, for instance, maybe you're standing in a grocery store and your loved one that's with you with Alzheimer's, they might say something like, "Oh my gosh, isn't she fat? I can't believe she's wearing those shorts. She looks so fat." And they say it so she can hear it. And the family member's just cringing. Oh my gosh. And again, they didn't do it to be mean, but that part of the brain's affected, and they don't know that that's a mean, hurtful thing to do, and they just blurt it out. So all these things we're talking about is so powerful, and that's why I so appreciate you guys coming today, because it's so powerful when you can learn these things. So you're not judging them, and you're not getting, hopefully, angry with them and frustrated. I mean, the reality is you might anyway, but hopefully it will help, because, again, they're doing the best they can. They just don't have control of those areas anymore because those cells have died. Also, the ability to adapt to new situations. And so, to have them go maybe to a new restaurant or do something new, they're very uncomfortable and very leery of doing that because they don't know how to function in a new situation like that. So we want to be respectful of that. Judgment becomes impaired. This is when the jerk comes up to the house and says, "Hey, I noticed you need a new driveway or a new roof. For $3,000, if you just write me that check right now, I'll take care of it for you tomorrow." And years ago, that person might have said, "You're crazy. That's pretty new. There's nothing wrong with it. Go away." But now, because that judgment's impaired, they write the check, and of course, they never see the driveway repaved. So that becomes tough when they're living on their own, especially. The judgment is impaired. They have difficulty also imagining something that's not visible. Abstract thought. So maybe if a woman's upset because she's looking for her husband, and the friend says, "Well, it's okay, he's going to be here tomorrow. He's going to come visit you tomorrow." That's an abstract thought, and he's not there, so it's very hard for her to understand that and grasp it because it's an abstract concept. Also in the front is where our mood is regulated. So we can see sudden mood swings. Again, not always, but it can happen. They could be very happy at one moment, and within a matter of a moment or two, they're very irritated and angry and maybe throwing something or whatever. Again, it's because that part of the brain's affected.
Can all these different parts be affected at different times in the
Yes.
Alzheimer's progress? I mean, it's not just one part of the brain and then another. It can be in
Yeah, that's a good point. And as it progresses through the brain, this is a general pattern, but it does vary person to person. Certainly.
I can see some of these in all of these in my mother, really.
Yeah. And also the brain isn't like this lobe only does this and this one only does this. There's some sharing of that kind of abilities and things too. For instance, the short-term memory is in the hippocampus and some in the temporal lobe here too. So, there's crossover. So yeah. And generally, and one of the handouts that I have back there for you, and these are available through the Alzheimer's Association if anybody wants to give them a call and get some handouts or anything. But generally we say there are 3 stages: early, middle, and late, and we can put these symptoms in these stages, but there's crossover. So yeah, you might have somebody that's truly in that middle stage, but they've got a few from the late stage. That's typically in the late stage. So it does vary a little bit, but there's a general pattern. Mm-hmm. Then it moves to the parietal lobe. And this is basically one of the main functions of the parietal lobe is to recognize spatial information. So again, this is where it's starting to affect vision, if you will. And have you ever seen this? Maybe you take a loved one out to eat at a restaurant and you have to go up a curb and they see the curb, but they're just feeling like this a lot. Because they can tell there's a little bit of difference there, but they can't quite tell how far it goes up and where their foot is in relation to that. That's very common. You also notice, and this is an example of how we can use this information to benefit the situation. People with Alzheimer's, especially in that middle and later stage, if they see, let's say we have a lighter colored floor, and if we've got a black welcome mat there, a lot of times you'll see them walk around it, because to them it looks like a black hole. Now we can use it to our advantage when maybe we have somebody that's still in their home, a spouse is taking care of them, but sometimes they try to leave the house and they're afraid they're going to get lost. So maybe you could try putting a black mat there and see if that will deter them from going outside. But you also want to remember it, for instance, in your house, that you don't want to have a lot of pattern on the floor. And you know, some facilities have wild floral carpets, and I just think, oh, that's got to be so confusing to somebody with Alzheimer's. So really their vision, their depth perception, relation to space, all gets messed up with this. Also, you might notice them, knocking over their glasses of milk at lunchtime quite a bit, again, and they're not trying to irritate you, but they have a hard time judging where their hand is in relation to that object. And so you might see a lot of accidents. Another reason caregivers need great patience.